Well, thank you all for joining us again for our final session on our baptismal promises. Tonight, we have Dr. Julius Carroll on what it means to strive for justice and peace in all the world. And Dr. Julius Carroll will, well, first of all, thank you for being here, Dr. Carroll, and for everyone for joining in these several weeks. And this is our final session here. Dr. Carroll, I would love to just have you go ahead and introduce yourself to the group and go ahead and continue on with your presentation.
Okay, thank you. And thank you all for being around the table with me this evening. I'm Julius Carroll. I'm the interim pastor at Ascension Church in Jackson, Mississippi. I'm a Philadelphia Seminary graduate, 1981 and again in 2008. I served 4 congregations in my ordained ministry in Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., Oakland, California, and Raleigh, North Carolina. Served on the bishop's staff in Philadelphia as director for urban ministry, and then was called to the ELCA staff, director for Catholic Descent ministry in the Multicultural Ministries unit, the ELCA. I was on Southern Seminary's faculty, responsibility for contextual education, multicultural ministries, and have served now 6 interim pastorates in my retirement. And the most present one now is down at Ascension. So I remember my baptism, which was June 4th, 1961. And I remember it because it was my confirmation day. My parents were Baptists out of Abyssinia Baptist Church in Harlem, where Adam Clayton Powell was pastor. Some of you know that name. And so I was not baptized until the morning of my confirmation day. So this baptismal promise, striving for justice and peace in all the earth. I wanted us to reflect on what does this striving for justice look like for African American Lutherans, because stories we can tell. And I want to share some of those stories with you this evening, as well as have conversation. So in a moment, we'll see a video, but I want to share with you the narrator's biographical story. My brother is going to open up the file for us, and you can read along.
All right, is this where you want me to share that Word file?
Yes, please.
Okay. All right, let me get that up for us.
Okay.
I'm going to zoom in just a little bit.
Mm-hmm. How does that look for folk?
We can see it.
You see it? Okay. So we're at Reverend Dr. Richard Stewart. This is the narrator of the video that you're going to see. Dr. Stewart died last year. He died in 2022. As a professor, Stewart taught seminarians about the essential aspects of communications and how to be effective administrators of congregations. Following his ordination, Stewart became assistant pastor of Westwood Lutheran Church in Dayton, Ohio, served as a consultant to urban crisis, was chaplain for the Dayton Rehabilitation Center, and director of Interfaith Campus Ministry at the historically Black University, Central State University in Wilberforce, Ohio. From 83 to 89, Stewart pastored Lord God of Sabaoth in Christiansted, St. Croix, on the Virgin Islands, which is a congregation that is more than 200 years old. By the way, St. Croix has 3 congregations on St. Croix. We have 2 on St. Thomas and 1 on St. John's in the Virgin Islands. In 1989, he joined the faculty of Lutheran Theological Seminary of Philadelphia, part of his Black Scholars Initiative, He also studied at Temple University, where he completed the coursework for a PhD. While at the seminary, Stewart earned a Doctor of Ministry degree. In retirement, he served as interim pastor of his home church, of Christ Church in Upper Darby, Pennsylvania. He was heavily involved in the Conference of International Black Lutherans, CIBL is what that's known as, and the African Descent Lutheran Association. The Conference of Black Leaders had a special place in his heart because of his desire to create a working relationship between Black Lutheran scholars and church leaders in the Northern Hemisphere and on the continent of Africa. During a 6-month sabbatical, he taught at the seminary in Pietermaritzburg, South Africa. Stewart served on numerous church and synodically affiliated boards, including an 8-year stint on the consulting committee of the Lutheran, now titled Living Lutheran, and twice serving on the board of directors of Trinity Seminary. At the time of his death, he was researching an extensive history depicting the contributions of Africans and African Americans to global and domestic Lutheran traditions. He had conducted scores of recorded interviews in which key Black leaders described the challenges and opportunities of contributing to those traditions. Members of the Conference of International Black Scholars have committed themselves to complete the work Stewart started. I'm pleased to be one of those. Location of Dr. Stewart's presentation is St. Michael's Lutheran Church in Germantown, Philadelphia. No longer, unfortunately, in existence as a Lutheran church. It is the largest nonprofit property in Philadelphia, with 2 square blocks of Lutheran saints triumphant in residence. And so if we go to the video.
Okay. I am going to, just to be on the safe side, I am going to, sorry, I'm going to get the URL in case for some reason my computer decides to stop working. Just in case, I'm going to put it in the chat here. All right, that way if for some reason I get knocked off, if somebody wants to faithfully carry on for me. Pastor Lee, are you feeling like you're capable maybe of sharing a video? You're not comfortable with that? Okay, well, I'm just going to go for it and we'll just see how this goes.
Let's just go for it.
All right.
Well, when it comes up, the question I would ask is, what struck you as you heard the stories of colleagues striving for justice? What struck you in the video? Here it is.
You hear okay?
Yeah. I think I might have to rewind it. Yeah, you have to rewind it.
It goes
Back to number 1. Okay, I think you got it. Yeah, okay. It's good.
Long time ago when I was in campus ministry, Grover asked me if I wanted to do a history of African American Lutherans. And I said, geez, what about the guys who are already in seminary education, like Rudy Featherstone, Pete Perro? And he said, well, they've all said no. I should have known then that there was a rationale for saying no, but I didn't. In college, I was a decent reporter, so I figured reporters have to do research, so I could do that. And so that's what got me looking at African American Lutheran history. And so obviously one of the first things you want to look for is, where do blacks appear in the church? Jehu Jones wasn't the first person I encountered in terms of being responsible to the Lutheran Church, but he was the first one ordained. A lot of people had thought it was Daniel Payne, but Payne was second. Jehu Jones grew up in Charleston, South Carolina, which is a whole nother part of the history, because it goes back to actually Muhlenberg. When he arrived in Charleston, South Carolina and went to the Salzburgers, he had free time after he left the Salzburgers, waiting for a ship to bring him to Philadelphia. And in that time, there was no TV, no internet, no solitaire on his computer. He organized a congregation called St. John's, and left that congregation, came to Philadelphia, and within a few years, it was an organized congregation of the church. Another Philadelphia connection was John Bachman. Interesting name. He did part of his training in Troy, New York. He came from Troy, New York, did part of his training here in Philadelphia. Before this, there was a seminary. So he was like an apprentice. But then his primary call then was to St. John's Lutheran Church, Charleston, South Carolina in 1815. Bachman brought in anyone in the community, and that meant blacks and whites, so that by around the 1860s, he had a Sunday school of 200 blacks, as well as a whole separate congregation of white folks in Charleston, South Carolina. And that's the center point for that congregation, sending the first 3 people to ordination. Yehu Jones was the first one. He was a tailor. His father owned a hotel. He was a freeman and was convinced that perhaps he ought to go to Liberia to do missionary work. He arrived here in the north late for the Synod Assembly. Travel was a bit more difficult then. And so he went to the Ministerium of New York. They ordained him after they were late, even he was late, but there were enough pastors still around to do that. They sent him back to Charleston, and then he ran into the runaway slave laws. He was given a set amount of time to leave South Carolina, brought his family to Philadelphia, and then attempted to try and raise money to go to Liberia. That did not work out well. But since he was then ordained as a pastor, not unlike Muhlenberg, he found people to come to church. And so in 1834, he was able to use a building that we now know is at 131 South Quint Street in Philadelphia, and it's St. Paul's Evangelical Lutheran Church. The cornerstone still exists. The building, though, now is the Mask and Wig Club of the University of Pennsylvania. So, a few years ago, we had a historical marker put there, and like a lot of historical markers, they are made out of bronze, and it has been lifted by someone unscrupulous. So we're trying to replace it. But it's one of the historical markers here in Philadelphia. The congregation did not survive, like a lot of urban congregations, well. The promised assistance from other congregations in the area did not prove to be sufficient. And so at one point the building was lost, but he ended up still being one of the influential pastors who wrote about the anti-slavery movement, about abolition of slavery, and others while he was here. His brother also came from Charleston, South Carolina, and was ordained an Episcopal priest and served in New Jersey. So that's the connection to Yehu Jones. Daniel Payne came after that, about 2 years after that, primarily because Bachman was a botanist. And he had gone to Bachman to identify plants that his children in his personal school had brought to him that he couldn't identify. So you go to the local expert. And he then came north, not to be a pastor, but to be a teacher. And so that's where he was given letters of introduction to Gettysburg, went to the college, and then also got involved with the anti-slavery movement and preaching, and even though he never really wanted to be a pastor, he says. But after a short time in the Frankian Lutheran Church, he got sick, came back to Philadelphia, recuperated, and the Methodists remembered that he had Methodist roots and brought him into the then African Methodist Episcopal Church. Later become a bishop and then the president of Wilberforce College, a place where I also served as campus pastor to the college community. So yeah, lots of connections that come out of Charleston, South Carolina. After moving to Philadelphia to be on the faculty at the seminary, obviously I've got this body of research that's sitting in my office. And I'm saying, I've got to figure out where this church was. It may not still exist, but I've got to figure it out. So there were a couple times where I went downtown to large skyscrapers, especially along Market Street in the eastern section of it, and went up in tall buildings to try and see if I could get a view of what the grid pattern of Philadelphia looked like. And that's when you discover that not only are there what we think are alleys, they're not alleys. There really are streets with houses, separate addresses, etc. So that got me into looking at the grid pattern of the city and how that got developed and redeveloped about 1850. And so the address that I had in my research didn't fit the current grid. The city had been regridded about 1850, 1860 by the Quakers, and so that it was a much more organized pattern. And so I just started walking the streets. I would take an afternoon and walk down to Philadelphia and just go, let me see what these streets are. And then finally I ran across the right street, because the signs are really small. It's right next to the Walnut Street Theater, is Quint Street. That's where it begins, and then it ends about Pine Street. And I just started walking and walking and walking, and all of a sudden I went, and I look at the architecture of buildings and look for arches around windows, the stone arches that might symbolize a church. And sure enough, I found it. Then I had to get permission to go into it because it was not an open building. It was a private club. When I contacted the Mask and Wig Club, they said they thought they knew the history of the building, which was already on the historical register as the Mask and Wig Club. And they said they thought it was a church, but they didn't know what kind of church. And I'm going, when I walked in and looked down, it says St. Paul's Evangelical Lutheran Church, 1834. And I went, I found the place, and I was trying to figure out why they didn't know it was a Lutheran church. These were University of Pennsylvania scholars. Duh. So I was not alone. One of my students at that time, Earl Johnson, was eventually an archivist. That's what he did. I mean, he's the kind of person who would go into the archives and dig through papers, sheet at a time, read them and try and figure out what was on that paper and what it meant, not only in terms of print, but also in terms of handwriting, calligraphy. And Earl was with me. We spent an hour with me shooting a video camera, and we didn't say a word other than, wow. We walked around the building, we took pictures of the inside, we went downstairs to what was then the Rathskeller, their bar. The tiles around the fireplace were all done in crosses, and we wondered whether or not they were there at the time it was a church or whether that was something done later. We think it was done later. We even crawled around into the rafters to see whether or not people had carved any initials or anything else in it, but we literally did not talk. I mean, when I saw I was going like, why didn't I say anything at all? But we didn't. We were just kind of awestruck. There were elements that were in the church which offered support, but the support never materialized. There was no support for his ministry. That never materialized. There were people who considered that he had raised money to go to Africa, and since he didn't do that, he was a fraud. You know, there were a combination of effects in that. There were people who even brought him up on charges, but most of them did not put him in jail. So it was kind of a mixed bag, but you got to remember, this is still 1834. It's before the end of slavery as an institution, and so there's a mixed bag of people's emotions going on. And he really was ministering to a segregated segment of the population, not unlike the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which had separated from St. George's, or the African Episcopal Church. So that all of those, in one sense, had a separate congregation, even though they were, in one sense, authorized by a larger church body. But that didn't necessarily mean that they then found support from that larger church body to assist them in ministry. Coming to the seminary, I was in my third year in St. Croix in the Virgin Islands, and I got a call from John Van Orsdal asking me if I would be interested in the Black Scholars Program at the seminary. The board and the faculty had chosen to use some of the funds of the seminary to assist a person in achieving the academic credentials to be on the faculty. That first person was James Kenneth Eccles, who then became a faculty member at the seminary, and then later the dean of the seminary, and then moved on to being the president of the Lutheran Theological School in Chicago, LSTC. At the time he was moving from the Black Scholars Program to full-time faculty, they then committed themselves to doing it again. And so I was asked whether or not I was interested. I said, I didn't think I could do that with one kid getting ready to graduate from high school and two of us in college at the same time and another son 5 years behind that. That didn't make economic sense. But a year later, after they'd gone through a couple of search processes with other folks, some of whom I had recommended, Dr. Van Orsdal called again and said, we know your reasons were valid a year ago. Are they still valid? I said, they're probably more valid now than they were last year, but let's talk. And he said, why? I said, well, the Holy Spirit doesn't often ask twice. So after negotiations, interviewing with the faculty, I received the call and came to the seminary on Epiphany in 1989. So beyond that, that's how I got here. Then I entered into a graduate program at Temple in Mass Media and Communications. Completed all the coursework, went through 6 advisors in 10 years. Needless to say, that was not a very productive process to go through. But at the same time, I was doing field education, teaching courses, and was directing the media center. So as one of the seminary presidents, Bob Hughes, said, you're really doing everything we want you to do, Rich. You know, the degree isn't important for us. And I said, it is for me. And at the point where in negotiations with faculty at Temple, it became clear that I was not going to be able to complete their process. I had gained sufficient knowledge so that the technology of the seminary radically shifted between the time I arrived in 1989, and at that point we were getting ready to build the new Brosman Center. And I was instrumental in most of that technological change because of the things I had learned at Temple. So I was able to put what I learned into practice. But I didn't have my degree yet. But by that time I had moved from instructor to assistant professor. I think I was sort of on the cusp of becoming an associate professor at that point. And that's when the seminary chose to put me in regular faculty status as opposed to the Black Scholars Program. And then they changed it to call it a Scholar of Color, and they called a third person, Nelson Rivera. And Dr. Rivera, again, came to Temple, worked on his graduate program, got his degree, and teaches in the theology department of the seminary. So there have been 3 of us who've come through that program. We've always had a program at the seminary as an alternate route to ordination. And that goes back to even when I was in seminary back in the late 60s, early 70s. Because there were only the ordination of men at that point, it was called the Older Men for the Ministry Program. And you had to be above, I think at that point, 50. So there's always been a way for the church to provide for folks who don't have a college degree to be able to move into ordained ministry without having the burden of a 4-year college education and then even a full 4-year seminary education. The current program of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America is the Theological Education for Emerging Ministries of the Church, which is much more inclusive. It's not necessarily racially oriented or age oriented, but it is sometimes even ethnically oriented, depending upon the needs of the particular community out of which a person emerges. After my sabbatical, I was asked if I wanted to direct that program, and I said yes. I guess perhaps it was even before the sabbatical. And so I then began to look at theological education in a two-track mode. Track one would be taking courses necessary for the completion of the theological degree to put a person in service for the church. And there would be no degree involved. But we also then offered the opportunity at the beginning of the process for a student to say, a degree is important for me. We would then work with them so that the courses they took on campus were full-time courses in the seminary curriculum. And they would then be able to use that as they went through the process of completing the ordination part of the process to continue on to obtain their degree. And there are several who have done that, including the pastor of this church, St. Michael's, where we're currently filming. So that she started as a teen program thinking it would be a one-year program, maybe two. She ended up finishing her degree, becoming a pastor of the congregation, and finally got her degree after being ordained. The reflection is one based upon my faculty colleagues, as it is the way in which we've affected students. There is a Church of God in Christ bishop in South Philadelphia, Ernest McNair. And it's a place where I've taken some students about church administration or evangelism and outreach on a couple of occasions, well, more than a couple of occasions. And at one point when we debriefed the experience with the students after they came back to the seminary, they said, he was Church of God in Christ, but he was preaching law and gospel. I said, yeah, and what's the question? And they said, well, why would he do that? Because that's not his tradition. I said, part of his tradition is this seminary. Because his Bible teacher was John Ruhlman. And so that influenced how he goes about using the gospel in a way, in a different denominational tradition, but still biblically oriented. So in one sense, we've had an effect on a number of congregations in the city through our evening program and weekend programs that has brought in people from other denominations. But I think that also says something to us about the way in which other faculty from different denominational traditions have also influenced us about our openness and not necessarily being closed to only our tradition, but to see the way in which our tradition connects with other traditions. What are our linkages? What are the things we hold in common? And if there are differences, how do we work those through so that we really can present a united presence of what does it mean to be the representatives of Christ crucified today? And that's an important structure that I think needs to be done. It's not just about being Lutheran or Presbyterian or Episcopalian. We are the disciples. We are the disciples who are then sent out to be fishers of people. And along the way, we have different strengths which bring people to the table. And we need to exercise all of those strengths. In one sense, the mission field in other countries, especially in the 20th century, where they would say, the Lutherans will go here, the Baptists will go here, the Episcopalians will go here, makes infinite sense in terms of making sure the gospel gets transmitted. We need to basically adopt that even in our own country today, in a way of saying other ministries are extremely valid, which brings people to the Word of God. Now,
We can stop there, Mike.
Doing that, how we share the responsibility for that, I think we need to do that in the context.
Okay. So, what struck you as you heard the stories of your African descent Lutheran colleagues? You're muted.
What struck me was I did not know that the Lutheran faith in America went as far back as it did in South Carolina and,
Mhm,
in Charleston. I
mhm,
really didn't know it went that far back.
mhm.
I really thought that most of it came through the western state of like not Michigan and Minnesota and Wisconsin.
Oh, yeah. The
But I
Lutheran
did not,
centers. Mhm,
yeah,
mhm.
but I did not know that it it was that far back.
Yeah, it's actually further back. The old, and now I believe is the oldest Lutheran church in the ELCA. Now it's on St. Thomas Virgin Islands, Frederick Church, founded in 1666.
Wow.
That's 1666.
I caught you.
Huh?
That means that's during the time that they were bringing slaves over to that
That's
area.
right. Yeah, and the roots are Danish. So they brought first the Danish people went over. They couldn't survive the climate. It was too hot and humid. So they started to bring slaves over. So like I told before, I told you how many congregations on the Virgin Islands. Then on the mainland here, the oldest Lutheran church is Our Redeemer in Washington, D.C. That was founded in 1885.
Wow.
I was the pastor there in 1990. I was just the fourth pastor. Congregation 1885. First pastor stayed 43 years. Second pastor stayed 35.
Wow.
And people would ask me, why did they stay so long? Well, where would an African American pastor go in the Lutheran Church in say 1950? Just to pick a year. No, because of racism. See, so they stayed where they were. Now that's the LCA branch. The oldest ALC is in Baltimore, and they were founded, St. Philip's, founded in 1887. And I used to never let my friends at St. Philip's forget that we in Washington, D.C. were the oldest. We always claim that. What else jumped at you with Dr. Stewart's telling the story here?
It seemed to me like no matter what struggles they hit in any one place, they would end up someplace else. So they never gave up that desire to preach the gospel. The Spirit moved them to another place that might be more receptive. So and I think that's amazing and wonderful, because that provided that wonderful foundation for the Lutheran Church hundreds of years ago. So
They could adapt.
And then what other common thread, like one of the common threads that I was struck when I was listening to him, again, first of all, he models this, and that it's intentional that he's in the street making this. He's not inside St. Michael's. He's not at the seminary, at the big amphitheater, right? He's in the street.
yeah.
And so because our history has been our African American Christian history, has been, we go out into the street. We see what the organizations are. We introduce ourselves, and we don't wait for people to just to come in.
Yeah.
So Richard was modeling that. Anything else? Yes, please. You're muted.
I was very interested in the
the model of evangelism that the current church could have learned from, because obviously they were out spreading a word that was an inviting and welcoming word to have a I'll say cross-cultural, cross-race community that early in a church that still has a problem with that in our current context and day and age. And in our topic today, the striving for justice and peace, I think thinking about and hearing this scholar of the church, justice is striving to make sure that we hear and tell a more complete story that is everybody's story. Because sometimes we assume we're telling the same story when we're not. And my ears always perk up when we say the seminary, when we know we have the seminaries in this tradition, and everybody thinks they go to the seminary.
That's right.
Tell a more complete story.
Right.
Everybody's story.
That's right. That's right. And that Pastor, and also the fact that in African American Christianity in general, we don't separate Jesus from justice. That there is no separation. And so, and how this plays out in terms of practical for clergy people is that expectation, I'm speaking generally now, okay, expectation in an African-American church, at African-American Lutheran as well, is that the pastor you call is to be involved in the community. And so it's and if being that involvement means running for a city council person or whatever, it's not oh my God, no, that's separation of church and state. And, we're paying this person to be the pastor. He's going to do something else. No, that's really the expectation in terms of the Black church over against, our history in terms of the Lutheran church, that separation of church and state.
It impressed me.
Yes, go ahead.
It impressed me when he, just like you were talking about, how we as African Americans go into the streets and we go to our congregation. We don't necessarily bring them into a building. We go, and he said, I remember him saying about go for the fishing of men. And that reminded me that, hey, he's truly doing Christ's work, because that's what Christ did. He went and told them, he said, I'm fishing for men. Right, that's right. And we talked about that, about the sons of Zebedee, right? And I wonder how Mr. Zebedee felt when not only his sons, but his wife left the business, to follow Jesus, I'm looking at the time, and Michael, I think, and you'll have this in the my narrative here will be part of the publication. I flesh out the elders vocationally in terms of Charles Leonard and Dr. Eccles, the people who Charles mentioned, Richard mentioned. I mean, so you'll have that information. But if Michael, would turn to page 4.
You want me to share the document, or do you want me to?
Yeah.
Okay.
The document, but at page 4.
Excellent.
Yeah. Please. Okay. And if we could go to the standing on the shoulders. And so, standing on the shoulders of the elders reflected this evening, where is the ELCA striving for justice as it relates to people of African descent? And to try to answer that, I'm sharing with you the ELCA African Descent Strategic Plan, the latest one, 2020 to 2025. And in that document says the challenges in the present ELCA are these. Few models and mentors in synodical and church-wide leadership roles. Minimal African descent lay leaders elected to synod and church-wide positions, because it's only institutionally human, is not that one nominates one who we know. Well, who do you know who's good in justice issues, or who's good in youth leadership? So we nominate them rather than trying because we know them, rather than widening the possibilities. Minimal numbers of African descent rostered leaders being interviewed for extended calls, predominantly white congregations. See, we have 19 Black pastors who serve predominantly white churches in 2020. Now, that doesn't seem like a whole lot of people, right? But for 30 years, we had one. Victor Langford in Seattle, Washington, was the only African-American pastor serving a predominantly white church for over 30 years. So even as a tiny number is moving the right way. African descent women rostered leaders spending 3 years seeking a first call. Minimal pensions upon retirement. Most African descent rostered persons serve very numerically small congregations, who, if a congregation is able, contribute sporadically to the ELCA Board of Pensions. And as you all know, we get out what is put in at the congregations in our years of ministry. So if it's minimal going in, it's going to be minimal coming out when we retire. A tremendous number of church buildings left to African Americans in the ELCA due to white flight. They are in disrepair and not suitable architecturally for the realities of urban ministry. 40 years has been a major challenge of reaching out to African American people. Then on page 5, when I graduated in 81, there were 45 pastors of African descent. That's a combined number for the ALC and the LCA. 2018, there were 143. And 2020, there are 289. So the breakdown of that is 283 African Americans, 4 African nationals, and 2 Afro-Caribbeans. So we need more than that, but we are making progress. Let me pause right there in terms of Afro-Caribbeans. Let me give you a hint, because I learned this the hard way when I was on church-wide staff. Woe to a person who goes in the Virgin Islands and refers to them as African Americans. You heard it from me, folks. Don't do that. They are Afro-Caribbeans, folks. For the Lutherans, they are of Danish ancestry. They're very proud of it. Okay, so just give you a little hint here. Don't do that. They're not African Americans. Out of 9,000 congregations, 2018, 143, at least 30% of people of African descent. 2020, there are 212. So we're moving a little bit there. That breakdown: 170 African Americans, congregations, 35 African national. Now, African nationals are those from the motherland, right? The Lutherans from Africa, who do have a history, by the way, on the continent of Africa. And 7 Afro-Caribbeans. The 2.5 million member church, 37,000 were African descent in 2018, is 43,000 in 2020. That number fluctuates, but in that 38, 39,000, I remember one time it was 44,000. It goes back, it fluctuates. It needs to be much more than that, obviously. So our strategy says, how is it LCA striving for justice within the context of African descent people? You see the strategy calls for engagement, identifying and building relationship with persons of color. That's what evangelism is, It's not making people Lutheran save their soul. It's building relationships and offering our perspective of following Jesus. See the difference there in terms of the attitudes, right? Involvement, inviting persons of African descent into meaningful initiatives. That is to say, we need to be around the table when major decisions are being made by the Synod or churchwide. And then investment in employing the gifts and resources of persons of African descent for fruitful return. I wasn't a part of this strategy. I was the strategy manager for the first one. But I think that fruitful returns is in there, is to say, we're looking for people of African descent who are going to bless us. We know that we're going to be a blessing to them. But we know their heritage, where they're coming from, they're going to be blessing us as well. I'm sure that's what that fruitful returns means. So having said that, there any clarification or questions regarding the plan, the ELC strategy? Any plan that jumps out at you regarding striving for justice? Are they manageable goals?
What will it take to get those numbers higher? What will it take for white congregations and the ELCA to say, this is not enough, we need more voice?
Right. That's exactly right. And the overall thing there, Patty, is that our white congregations need to see both this plan and the other ethnic group strategies. They are our strategies.
Right.
It's not those for the Black people here and for the Asians here. This is the church's strategy, you know. And so then that plays into resources. You heard Dr. Stewart talk about, and it's longstanding how we have. I've done some research on the African American Lutherans in the South. When we had a big push in the early 1990s, first of all, we had a white pastor who headed the African American outreach strategy. P.E. Krebs was his name, and he was in charge of African American outreach for a good 15 years. Mm-hmm. So that says a lot there, right? Is that? But so what he would do, he would find stables and shacks and all kind of made no sense of property, and then have a Black pastor go in there and try to build the congregation. And then historically, the Black pastors in the 1900s, their salaries half of the white pastors in the South. Mm. Those and you get that all through the history of African American Lutheranism in this country. That's why the research I wrote is entitled "Stories We Could Tell," because we got some stories to tell about our involvement in this Lutheran church. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So just see, I'm looking. Oh, good. We got 5 minutes. So you see on that, affirming the guidance, the ELCA future directions. It's a part of the strategy. Talks about justice, and I talked about before about we don't separate Jesus from justice, and that's what we bring. That's what we Black Lutherans bring to the table in terms of the Lutheran Church. And then on page 6, Michael. And then the prophetic and priestly dimension. Once again, that's not separating Jesus from justice. We bring that as well. So that's just a very brief, highlight of where we are because of African descent. And I focus, by the way, on African Americans because I know more about that than I do African nationals, and I don't dare speak for the African nationals. They have their own story to tell.
Dr. Carroll?
Yes.
it makes me even prouder of one of our congregants that turned Pastor Tina Culpepper, who ended up in Dalton, Georgia, to an all-white congregation. It makes me even more proud because she came from, I'm a member of the Lutheran Church of the Atonement.
Oh, are you?
Yes.
I preached in your church years ago.
Yes, you have. and it just makes me feel so proud that she came from our church, but then she ended up in Dalton, Georgia. And at the time when they called her, I don't even think they realized that she was Black.
Oh, really?
I don't think they did. They wanted a pastor really, really bad. And then when they found out, and she sent them,
The picture.
No, they had to do
Paperwork.
sermons
Oh.
on
Okay.
the pandemic,
Okay.
because they were really losing a lot of their members. They were just.
Yeah. All across the ELCA, we've lost so many people.
Yes, we have.
Because of COVID. Yeah. Well, that's great. So she's one of the 19. No?
Yes, she is. Yes, she is.
Does anybody remember Will Hertzfeld, who was the AELC president during the merger?
Hertzfeld.
Yeah, Hertzfeld. Will Hertzfeld.
The name is familiar.
That makes a bit, yeah. He has a German name, but he was an African American from the South. I want to say Mobile, Alabama. I'm almost positive he's from Mobile. So, but he has a German name, right? Well, he tells the true story. He was a pastor in Oakland, California, for years, and then became elected the president of the AELC. But he tells the story how he got a letter. Bethlehem was a Missouri Synod church originally. And he got this letter from a church in Iowa, this big Missouri Synod church, and said, Dr. Hertzfeld, it was good to us and to the Holy Spirit that you become our senior pastor. Enclosed the paperwork and all this, about how big the church was, et cetera. So Will read it, and he swears, he said, this is a true story. He's died. He has died now. But he said, so he read it, and so he knew they didn't realize that he was Black. See, so he wrote them back. He said, of course I have to consider it because it might be the Spirit, speaking. He closes my photograph, right? And so he waited and waited and waited.
Oh boy!
Finally got a letter, right? He said, "Will swears this is the truth." He said the letter said, "Dear Dr. Hertzfeld, we believe the Holy Spirit made a mistake."
Oh, no.
Whoa.
Oh, no.
Well, I can, this is Pastor Michael here. I left my video off because of the computer issues, but part of what I know that here in the Southeastern Synod that Bishop Strickland is really keen on is helping us to educate our congregations and to invite them into the stories of, mostly white congregations, to invite them to a broader story. As Pastor Lee, you said it much more nicely earlier. You said it much more eloquently about hearing the stories of others. And I think, I know for me personally, as I work with congregations and their transitions, that I know I do, and Pastor Patty did on the Synod staff when she was with us, was to really do some of that hard work of kind of hold the mirror up to our mostly white folks and say, here's other stories, and here's where you have, whether you intended it or not, here's where you've made some grave errors in thinking that you had the whole picture of Christianity or Lutheranism, that there's a broader story than yours. And I think this tonight highlights that. And, you talk about the future goals and such, and what does the future church look like? And there's a lot of talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion these days. And Dr. Carroll, I think you said it well when you said it's about storytelling. or somebody mentioned that. And I think that's important because when you invite somebody into a story, I think you start to humanize the issues. It's not just an issue anymore. It's flesh and blood.
That's
And
right.
it's right next door to us, and it's right across the street, and it's across the town. And these are, when we share these stories with one another, it helps us to broaden the understanding. And sometimes we have to tear down a little bit of what we believe in order to build it back up in a more inclusive way. So that's part of the work I know we're committed to in the Southeastern Synod, and we're on the way together.
Yeah, and those brave. I'm grateful for the brave congregations. Because I told you I did interim in upstate New York, outside of Syracuse, a place called Liverpool, and it's a rather large church, white church, and they because I'm interim, they didn't call me. They hired me for the interim pastor, and when the word got out that I was at King of Kings in Liverpool, people were writing me from all over the country. That church, called you as interim pastor, because it's so rare that that happens. But the people, they told me story after the synod did. The bishop told them, now this is an African American man, and he has this experience, this and that. And they said, Bishop, you think he can do the job? And the bishop said, absolutely. I said, okay, let's get him, But that made such a statement across the ELCA. Julius went to this church in Liverpool, And then my next one was even a larger church in upstate New York. Friends of mine stopped calling me. Then they said, oh, what? That upstate New York is something else, Then before coming here, I was in downtown Buffalo at the Cathedral Church in Buffalo. So there was, people, saw that. Well, yeah, we do have qualified African American pastors. Men and women, by the way.
Thank you.
Well, Dr. Carroll, we thank you so much for leading us in this final conversation around our baptismal promises, especially highlighting today to strive for justice and peace in all the world. And that might look like striving for justice and peace in our neighborhoods and the ELCA, all those different contexts in which we find ourselves. So thank you for sharing and for the resources today.
Sure.
I thank you all for joining us during this whole series, and would love to continue to have you join us for future events. We'll continue to put the word out through our website and social media and such. And so thank you. Pastor Lee put something in the chat there about a Danish congregation. And yes, seeking to learn more about the Afro-Caribbean Lutheran Church story.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Excellent.
Yeah, they have Frederick Church of St. Thomas has its own archival library, and it's the only place in the building that's air conditioned. With nature. And there are tons of resources there, and it's Frederick Evangelical Lutheran Church from St. Thomas.
Wow.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again. Thank you all, and look for the information coming to you on Wednesday morning. And once again, just thank you all, especially Dr. Carroll this evening for leading us.